All right, we're joined once again by George Khalaf from Data Orbital. George, we visited with you a lot in the lead up to election. This is our look back, so thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
All right, a few issues to talk about. One of the things that we talked about a lot in our conversations before the election is what did early voting look like? In the early days, Republicans opened up like a 12-point lead. That diminished quickly headed into election day. So remind us what exactly happened with early voters.
Yeah, so as you said, early voting started off very favorable to Republicans. It sort of slowly went down, which we expected. We never expected it to be as good as it was the first week, but it really took a dive the last week, and it ended up around 7%. And again, conventional wisdom says that we go into election day, Republicans do slightly better on election day, and then slightly better with early drop-offs. That clearly is not the case, right? We won't know final numbers until the voted file comes out, which is after the canvass, which was signed yesterday. But we do know enough that as votes were counted progressively on, particularly in Maricopa and Pima, things got a lot worse for a lot of Republicans. So we can only imagine that the Republican ballot advantage continued to shrink, or maybe an even inverse in Maricopa County, where the last couple of days, Republicans and Democrats were at parity.
One of the things we talked about before the election was, well, are the parties just cannibalizing their election day voters? When you see people voting early, these are people who would have voted election day anyway. Can you tell us about who these people are, where they come from, what their behavior is?
Yeah, I still contend that neither party cannibalized their vote. I still think that the reason why the election day was what it was and the early drop-offs were what they were was because Democratic turnout was just sky high, and that enthusiasm, that wave that people had talked about didn't really emerge until the last week and then really crescendoed into election day. We did an analysis the day before election day actually to show that we didn't think either side had cannibalized. I just think Democrats did a better job of turning out every last possible voter that they could. And quite frankly, I think the numbers are going to show, and again, we'll wait a couple weeks to make a definitive decision on this. I think the numbers are going to show that certain Democrats, particularly ones that won, and particularly those that won Maricopa County, ended up winning double-digit Republicans and ended up doing very well with independents. There's no path to victory for Democrats still statewide if they don't win more than a majority of independents, probably independents by close to 10%. But I think even some Democrats, particularly someone like Sinema, won probably 15%, maybe a little bit less of Republicans, which is not a small task.
I know we're still waiting for what you called the voted file, but can you comment a little bit about turnout generally? You had talked early in the run-up to this about eclipsing typical midterm election numbers, and you were saying we're in presidential territory. Any sense of where we landed on that?
We got close. We didn't quite get to presidential year turnout, but this was the highest turnout in, I believe, 5 counties, as the Secretary of State talked about today, that those counties had ever had in a midterm election. And so turnout was sky high, and I think it came from both sides. It would have been a lot worse for Republicans if the turnout enthusiasm was just on the Democrat side. It came from both. It's just Democrats were still slightly more excited. And like I said, there was a crossover, and on certain races, I think they won more independents. But again, turnout with or without the voted file, we know it was really high, very, very high. And so the bar has been set, quite frankly, very high for presidential. There's a lot of talk, even in national elections. So in the presidential after midterm, where it was sort of record for that generation, turnout for that presidential tends to also be another record-setting year. So we're on pace to get to close to, I think it was 75% or somewhere, like, again, like record-shattering numbers for turnout in the presidential in 2020. That's what they think we're on pace for.
I want to talk to you about some statewide races, but let's talk about the legislature first. We had, in the run-up to the election, we talked about certain legislative districts that were going to be very closely contested. Those were on brand. They lived up to their expected competitive standing. Let's talk about Legislative District 18, Ahwatukee, South Tempe, West Chandler, and next door, Legislative District 17 in Chandler. You were saying that these were going to be razor thin going in. That proved to be the case. Let's talk about 18 first. What is your reaction to results there?
Unfortunately, 18 was the one that I was the least surprised for. I had commentary that I put out about a week before showing that the race on the Senate side was a toss-up. Obviously, as we know, Schmuck ended up losing. It was not a toss-up in any way. I think what that's going to show is that the turnout model we were using, the expected turnout model, was being much too generous for Republicans. I think we're going to end up seeing that Democrats absolutely blew turnout out of the water, and there was a Democratic ballot advantage that was probably what we would have expected the Republican ballot advantage to be.
Flipped it in 18.
And I think 18 and 28 to some extent, which I know we're not talking about, but 18 particularly, there are fundamentals there that Republicans need to take care of, right? Republicans, and I think parties in general in Arizona, think that, okay, fundamentals are good for Republicans, so we're not necessarily going to do tons of voter registration. We're not going to do a lot of what we would call kind of the the unsexy things from a boots on the ground perspective, well, 18, that's needed, right? Any district that's in Congressional District 9 absolutely needs it. That part of the state has changed very dramatically for Republicans. We had a congressional candidate that lost by 20% there, Steve Farrar. And Steve Farrar, by all measures, was an excellent candidate, raised decent money. I know it wasn't a good year, but he really was a great candidate and fit the district. Didn't have a chance because I think the fundamentals are difficult. And that creeps into 17 next door, because 17, parts of it are in Congressional District 9. And the parts that are in Congressional District 9, those precincts that did a number crunching, the Republican there lost, Mesnard, for example, lost by some like 20, 25% in some of those precincts, but then did very well in the Congressional District 5 portion of Chandler. So we're talking about, again, two districts that's fundamentals are just right on the edge. And we'd predicted 17 was going to be on the edge after the 16 election, based on some down ballot races. And it ended up unfortunately panning out as it did in other districts as well.
When you hear about the GOP struggling in suburban districts, in the suburbs, districts 17 and 18, are those the canaries in the coal mine if you're the GOP?
100%. 17 and 18 really are the absolute example of affluent, well-educated suburban districts that Republicans lost all across the country. So again, this is not the only place that those happened. Now, there is a positive spot for Republicans. There were statewide candidates that still won those or lost them by very small margins. And so there is a path forward. Work needs to start yesterday. Really, work needed to start the day after Election Day, recruiting right candidates. I think there's a lot to say after this election about the type of candidates that both parties run. Right, where Republicans did poorly, sometimes it was because it was not that good of a candidate, but odds are it was actually because it was a great Democrat candidate. And the places where Democrats, I think, could have been more competitive, it was because there was not a good candidate at all, and there was a stellar Republican candidate. So a lot of this, again, the fundamentals tied with the types of candidates that both sides have, I think could lead the Republicans to gain every seat that was lost in the House going into 2020. Or it could stay the exact same and even lose a couple seats if we don't learn from what happened this last cycle.
All right, so we zoomed in close to some of these legislative districts. Let's pull back to statewide. Governor Ducey won, and he won by a lot.
Yes, outperformed Senator McCain, by the way, in 2016. And people always sort of talk about in political folklore on the Republican side in terms of how well someone like McCain does and the path to victory to dominate statewide here in Arizona. And Governor Ducey took that same path and actually expanded upon it.
Okay, well, let's key in on that, because you've heard some commentary that his opponent ran a rotten campaign. But let's give Governor Ducey a little credit. He ran a very good campaign.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, look, David Garcia was not a good candidate. We said it on the show multiple times. A lot of people said it a lot of places. But the governor was an excellent candidate. And that race would have still been tighter, even with Garcia being as poor of a candidate as he was, had Governor Ducey not run a really good campaign. And the reason why we know that is the outperformance that Governor Ducey had, even with other Republicans, means that all the Republicans locked up the Republican vote, but he was able to win a lot more independent vote, and that's critical. You don't win more independent votes because the other guy sucks. You win more independent votes because you're running a disciplined campaign, you're talking about education, you're talking about economic development. I think that's going to be a big indicator to show why that race went the way it was, not just because Garcia was a poor candidate, but because the governor ran a really good campaign.
All right, let's move to the U.S. Senate, where Kyrsten Sinema was the victor. She wins in Pima County, not a huge story. Is the story here the way she performed in Maricopa County?
Absolutely. I said it right here about a week before Election Day. I said in order for her to win, she needs to outperform Clinton. And you remember I said she needs to outperform Clinton by a healthy margin. Well, she outperformed Clinton by 6, 7, 8, 9, as high as 10, 12% in some districts. And so in the places where Clinton did well, she did much, 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 much better. And then McSally actually then did slightly worse than Trump in a number of rural districts. So it was sort of both sides. It was she did much better. We had said that Sinema, in order for her to win, she needs to do very well in Maricopa County, and she needs to claw back some of the gains that Trump made in rural Arizona, and she did. She held her own in rural Arizona, still lost most of the legislative districts, but held her own, and she did very well in Maricopa County. So her path to victory was the exact thing that pundits were talking about, and she walked that path straight to, obviously, the U.S. Senate.
And you had mentioned we just discussed the GOP collapse in the suburbs. She was the beneficiary of that, right?
Yeah.
She picked those votes up.
Absolutely. She was the beneficiary of that. And you were doing an analysis earlier today by legislative district of the best Republican statewide, removing Governor Ducey, because he outperformed tremendously, in the worst Republican. And the gap there was really large. And what that tells me is, and most of the time it was either Frank Riggs by legislative district that was the lowest, did the worst as a percentage. Usually it was Congresswoman McSally. And so what that tells me is that there were Republicans that were in fact picking and choosing down the ballot, which again is another thing. Talk about things in political circles that very rarely happen. A lot of those things happened this last cycle, right? So you add in the really bad national environment, you add in the perfect storm here for Democrats, you add in some good candidates, and then you add in a lot of fundamentals that never occur that occurred. So it was sort of like lightning struck, which is why I still think it'll be hard to repeat some of the same victories. But a lot went right for them. Everything that needed to go right essentially went right.
All right, let's close out with the free advice portion of the show. If you are a Democrat candidate looking to run statewide, do you do your best to replicate the cinema effort of 2018?
100%. I look to recruit candidates that look like cinema, talk like cinema, and I camp out in suburbs, not just for the next 2 years, I camp out in suburbs for the next 4 years, right, going into 2022. Because if you're a Democrat, you're not really looking at 2020, you're looking at 2022 for the statewides to either retain the pickups that you got and to either pick up other stuff. So I camp out in the suburbs and I just talk about how horrible Republicans are in this post-Trump world, and you just kind of keep sowing that narrative and probably talk about education.
Okay, you are state House Democrats. You now have you're down just a little bit now, 31-29. Your advice to Democrats if they wanted to flip a chamber?
Oh man, I'm camped out in the state House. That would be my 2-year goal. If I was a Democrat political, I'd be taking over the state House.
So if we're going to focus on a chamber, we're focusing on the state House.
We're focusing on the state House, and we're focusing on single shot candidates in places where the margin was very small. There's some very peculiar districts, right? I'm just going to throw this out there, District 23. Not saying Democrats can pick something up.
This is in Scottsdale.
This is in Scottsdale, Fountain Hills. Go back and look at some of those results. Look at how close the state House candidate was, the single shot Democrat, was to Jay Lawrence, the lowest Republican in the state House. Some very interesting things when you start looking at it that way. So if I'm a Democrat, I'm going after the state House.
Republicans, you maintain your 17-13 majority in the state Senate. It wasn't easy by any means, but you've done it. Your majority has shrunk dramatically in the state House. Your advice to them going into the next election?
My advice to Republicans is to remember, we're still in Arizona. Learn from what happened. Don't lick your wounds for too long. Go out there and register new voters, get an excitement about you, and be disciplined on messaging and recruit the right candidates. All the losses that occurred could be won back in 2 years for those that are up in 2 years, and the statewides could be won again in 4 years. We're going to have a much better scenario in 2022, theoretically, for Republicans. So Republicans can get everything back that was lost, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and folks need to learn, and it starts with message discipline, it starts with recruiting the right candidates, and it starts with not having absolutely bruising primaries, quite frankly, especially when primaries carry on into the general election.
George, we just want to say thanks for being with us throughout the election season. Now this look back. I think you're going to be with us again in January because now we're officially in the 2020 cycle. So thanks for being with us.
Absolutely.